Billionaire never believed in love until his newborn baby made him fall for his wife again. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The mahogany desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor where Graham Lockwood sat, reviewing quarterly reports at 11:47 p.m. His tailored navy suit remained wrinkle-free despite the 16-hour workday, his steel-gray eyes scanning numbers that would make most people dizzy. At 35, Graham had built his financial empire on one simple principle. Emotions were expensive, and he couldn't afford them. The elevator dinged softly in the distance. Graham didn't look up. His assistant had left hours ago, but the cleaning crew always worked late on Wednesdays. He flipped another page, his Mont Blanc pen making precise notations in the margins. Mr. Lockwood, the voice was unfamiliar, soft, almost hesitant. Graham's head snapped up. A woman stood in his doorway holding a stack of books against her chest like armor. She wore a simple cream cardigan over dark jeans, her auburn hair falling in waves past her shoulders. She looked completely out of place in his world of glass and steel. "The reception is on the 38th floor, he said coolly, assuming she was lost from the corporate mixer happening downstairs. "I know." She stepped into his office uninvited. "I was looking for somewhere quiet to read." Graham sat down his pen. "This is a private office. I'm sorry." "The party was," she gestured vaguely, searching for words. "Too much talking, not enough listening." Despite himself, Graham found his attention caught. Most people who entered his office wanted something. Money, deals, partnerships. This woman wanted quiet. "What are you reading?" he asked, surprising himself. She held up a worn paperback. "Poetry, Mary Oliver. Not exactly cocktail party material. Tell me, what else should I have done?" "Doesn't everything die at last and too soon?" Graham quoted, watching her eyes widen in recognition. "You know her work. I know a lot of things." He leaned back in his chair. "I just don't usually discuss them at parties." "Neither do I." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "That's why I'm hiding in a stranger's office, apparently." Graham Lockwood. He stood, extending his hand. "Elise Montgomery." Her handshake was firm, warm, and now I feel terrible for barging in. "You're probably the host of this whole thing. Close, major investor." Graham studied her face, noting how she didn't immediately change her demeanor upon learning his name. Either she was an exceptional actress, or she genuinely didn't know who he was. Both possibilities intrigued him. Elise glanced around his office at the awards on the walls. The city lights stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the calculated perfection of everything. "It must be lonely up here." The observation hit something unexpected in Graham's chest. "I prefer solitude to meaningless conversation." "There's a difference between solitude and isolation," Elle said quietly. "Solitude is chosen. Isolation just happens." They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the party filtering up through the building's ventilation system. Graham couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him without an agenda, without wanting something. "Would you like coffee?" He found himself asking. Real coffee, not whatever they're serving downstairs. "At midnight." "I was planning to work until 2 anyway." Elise shifted the books in her arms. "Considering only if you let me make it. I work at a publishing house. I know my way around late-night coffee." As she moved toward his private kitchenette, Graham realized he was watching her with the same focus he usually reserved for financial projections. There was something about the way she moved through his space without trying to impress him, something about how she'd sought quiet in a world that demanded noise. 12 months later, they would be married in a small ceremony that felt more like a business merger than a love story. Graham would convince himself he'd made a practical choice. Elise was intelligent, independent, unlikely to interfere with his work. She would tell herself that maybe love could grow from respect and shared silences. But on that night, as Elise handed him a perfect cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from his desk with her poetry book, neither of them knew they were planting seeds in ground too cold to nurture them. The coffee was perfect. The conversation was easy, and for the first time in years, Graham Lockwood forgot to check the time. By morning, he would remember who he was. By their wedding day, the walls would be back up, and by the time their daughter was born, the man who quoted poetry at midnight would seem like a dream Elise had invented. But that night, for a few precious hours, anything seemed possible. What happens when two people meet at the perfect moment but marry at the worst possible time. The wedding had been beautiful, in the way that expensive things often are, flawless, cold, and forgettable. 12 months after that midnight conversation over coffee, Elise Montgomery became Elise Lockwood in a ceremony that felt more like a corporate acquisition than a celebration of love. Now, 6 months into their marriage, Elise sat at the breakfast table of their Manhattan penthouse, spreading cream cheese on a bagel while Graham scrolled through his phone with surgical precision. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space that belonged in architectural magazines but felt nothing like home. "I'll be in Singapore next week," Graham said without looking up. "The Hartwell merger needs my attention." Elise nodded, taking a small bite of her bagel. She'd learned not to ask how long he'd be gone. The answer was always, "as long as it takes." And her follow-up questions had begun to sound like complaints, even to her own ears. "I might visit my sister while you're away," she said carefully. "She's been asking about us." "Fine." Graham finally glanced up, but his eyes held the same distant focus she'd grown accustomed to. "Just remember, we have the Peton dinner when I get back." Another corporate obligation disguised as social engagement. Elise had become an expert at smiling through conversations about market volatility and investment strategies, nodding at the appropriate moments while wives of other executives discussed charity galas she'd never be invited to plan. Graham's phone buzzed. He answered it before the second ring. "Lockwood." "Yes. I saw the Shanghai numbers. That's unacceptable. I want a full report on my desk within the hour." Elise finished her bagel in silence, watching her husband transform into the man who commanded boardrooms with surgical precision. This was the Graham she knew. Sharp, demanding, untouchable. The man who had quoted Mary Oliver seemed like a character from someone else's story. After Graham left for the office, Elise wandered through their penthouse like a ghost haunting someone else's life. The space was immaculate. Mahogany furniture, abstract art, fresh flowers arranged by a service she'd never met, everything carefully curated to project success. She found herself in Graham's study, a room she rarely entered. His desk was organized with military precision, pens arranged by size, documents stacked at perfect right angles, a single photo of their wedding day positioned strategically where visitors could see it. In the photo, they looked like strangers performing happiness for the camera. The bookshelf caught her attention. She'd expected financial journals and market analysis, but hidden between volumes on international banking were poetry books. Mary Oliver, Pablo Neruda, Billy Collins books with worn spines and dog-eared pages. Evidence of someone who had once believed in beauty beyond profit margins. Elise pulled out the Mary Oliver collection, the same one she'd been reading the night they met. A piece of paper fluttered to the floor, a boarding pass from their honeymoon in Santorini. For a moment she remembered that week differently. Graham had been present, almost gentle. They'd watched sunsets from their terrace, shared quiet dinners overlooking the Ion Sea. He'd even read to her one evening, his voice soft in the Mediterranean twilight. But that version of Graham had disappeared. The moment they'd returned to New York, the man who had held her hand on cobblestone streets became the stranger who scheduled their conversations around conference calls. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her editor's name. "Elise, thank God, you answered. We need someone to cover the Morrison book launch tonight." "I know it's short notice, but I'll do it," Elise said quickly. The prospect of spending an evening discussing literature instead of quarterly earnings felt like oxygen to someone who'd been drowning. That evening at a small bookstore in Brooklyn, Elise remembered who she used to be. She interviewed the author about his debut novel, a story about second chances and the courage to start over. The bookstore was cramped and warm, filled with people who chose books over balance sheets. "What draws you to stories about redemption?" Elise asked the author during their recorded conversation. "I think we all want to believe people can change," he replied. "That love can wake us up from the lives we've sleepwalked into." Elise's hand stilled on her notebook. The words hit something raw and true, a reminder of dreams she'd buried beneath good china and corporate galas. She returned home near midnight to find Graham still in his study, surrounded by documents that would determine someone's financial future by morning. He looked up when she entered, and for just a moment, she saw something that might have been curiosity. "How was your evening?" he asked. "Inspiring," Elise said honestly. "I'd forgotten how much I love my work." Graham nodded and returned to his papers. That's good. Career satisfaction is important. Career satisfaction, as if her passion for storytelling was just another asset to be managed and optimized. Elise stood in the doorway watching her husband work with the same intensity other people reserved for life or death situations. She wondered if he even remembered the man who had made her coffee at midnight, who had spoken about solitude and isolation, as if he understood the difference. Graham, she said softly. He didn't look up. Do you ever miss it? The person you were before all this success? His pen stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of city traffic far below their perfect penthouse. Success isn't something you achieve, Graham said finally. It's something you maintain every day without exception. He returned to his documents, and Elise understood that the conversation was over. She walked to their bedroom alone, as she did most nights, and lay awake, wondering if the man she'd married was still somewhere inside the stranger who shared her bed. Outside their windows, Manhattan glittered like a circuit board, all connection and no warmth. And somewhere in that maze of ambition and achievement, two people who had once found each other in the quiet spaces between words were slowly learning to live as strangers. The pregnancy test sat on the marble bathroom counter like a verdict, waiting to be read. Elise had been staring at it for 3 minutes, watching the second pink line grow darker, more definite, more real. 2 lines, pregnant. Her hands trembled as she picked up the test, holding it closer to the vanity lights as if proximity might change the result. But there it was, undeniable proof that their careful, distant marriage had created something neither of them had planned for. Through the bathroom door, she could hear Graham on a conference call with Tokin, his voice sharp and commanding as he discussed currency fluctuations and market projections. It was 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday, but Graham's schedule didn't recognize weekends. Elise sat on the edge of their oversized bathtub, still clutching the test. She'd suspected for weeks the exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, the way coffee suddenly made her nauseous, the strange tenderness in her chest when she hugged herself. But suspecting and knowing were different countries entirely. A baby. Their baby. For the first time in months, something like hope flickered in her chest. Maybe this would change everything. Maybe Graham would remember how to be present, how to look at her like she was more than just another responsibility to manage. Maybe they could find their way back to each other through this tiny person who would need them both. She walked to their bedroom where Graham was pacing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, still on his call. His hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour. His casual Saturday attire, khakis and a polo shirt, pressed and pristine. I don't care if the Hong Kong markets are closed, Graham was saying. Find someone who can give me those numbers now. Elise sat on the edge of their bed waiting. The test felt warm in her palm, this small plastic oracle that might rewrite their future. Graham ended his call and glanced at her briefly. I need to go into the office. The Yamamoto deal is more complex than we anticipated. Graham, wait. Elisa's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. I need to tell you something. He paused, checking his watch. Can it wait until tonight? I'm already behind schedule. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them like a question neither had thought to ask. Graham went completely still, his hand frozen halfway to his phone. What? Elise held up the test. Its 2 pink lines now feeling like evidence of something miraculous and terrifying. I just took the test. We're going to have a baby. Graham stared at the plastic stick as if it were a document written in a language he didn't understand. His face went through a series of micro-expressions. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been panic, and finally a careful blank. Are you certain? The test is pretty clear. Elise set it on the nightstand between them. I'll call Dr. Henley on Monday to confirm, but we'll need to discuss logistics. Graham's voice had shifted into what Elise privately called his boardroom mode. Efficient, detached, problem-solving, healthcare, finances, childcare arrangements. I'll have my assistant research the best pediatricians in the city. Elise felt something inside her chest grow cold. Graham were having a baby, not acquiring a new asset, of course. But his eyes were already distant, calculating. This changes our timeline for several projects. I'll need to restructure some investments, make sure we're financially prepared. We're billionaires, Graham. Money isn't the issue. Money is always the issue. Children are expensive. Education, healthcare, security. We'll need to plan for everything. Elise watched her husband transform their unexpected miracle into a series of spreadsheet entries and strategic considerations. This was how Graham approached everything. Reduce it to manageable components, assign resources, optimize outcomes. Don't you have any feelings about this? She asked quietly. Graham looked at her, then really looked, and for a moment she saw something unguarded in his expression. Fear maybe, or something deeper, a vulnerability he'd spent years learning to hide. I'm processing, he said finally. This is significant news. It's our child, Graham. Our baby. I understand that. But his phone was already buzzing, and his attention was already splitting. We should schedule an appointment with Dr. Henley as soon as possible, get a timeline, understand what we're dealing with, as if pregnancy were a hostile takeover to be managed rather than a life to be celebrated. The phone kept buzzing. Graham glanced at it with the longing of an addict eyeing a fix. Take it, Elise said, resignation settling over her like a familiar coat. I know you want to. It's the Singapore office. This will just take a minute. But Elise knew better. Graham's minutes had a way of becoming hours, his quick calls expanding into emergency meetings that lasted until midnight. She left him in their bedroom, already deep in conversation about profit margins and market volatility, and wandered to the kitchen. The pregnancy test sat forgotten on their nightstand. 2 pink lines bearing witness to a moment that should have changed everything, but had somehow changed nothing at all. Standing by their massive windows, looking out at Central Park stretching green and alive beneath the morning sun, Elise placed her hand on her still flat stomach. Somewhere inside her, their baby was growing, a cluster of cells that would become eyes and fingers in a heartbeat. It's going to be different, she whispered to the tiny life inside her. When you're here, everything will be different. You'll make us remember how to love. But even as she said the words, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that she was making promises she had no power to keep. Graham was already back to his normal routine, the news of their child absorbed into his catalog of things to manage and optimize. From their bedroom, she could hear his voice rising with familiar authority. I don't care what the market projections say. I want those numbers verified by someone who actually understands what they're looking at. Elise pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing, calling people to Sunday service. But in their perfect penthouse, surrounded by everything money could buy, she had never felt more alone. The obstetrician's office smelled like vanilla and disinfectant, a combination that made Elise's stomach turn even more than usual. At 12 weeks pregnant, morning sickness had become an all-day companion, leaving her exhausted and hollow-eyed. Graham sat beside her in the waiting room, scrolling through emails on his phone with the focused intensity of a surgeon. He'd arrived 10 minutes late, apologizing briefly before diving back into what he called the crisis situation. Though Elise had learned that everything was a crisis situation in Graham's world. Mrs. Lockwood, a nurse, appeared with a clipboard and a smile that was practiced but kind. Dr. Henley is ready for you. In the examination room, Elise lay on the paper-covered table while Graham positioned himself in a chair that gave him a clear view of both her and his phone screen. The ultrasound technician, a middle-aged woman named Carmen, squeezed cold gel onto Elise's barely rounded belly. First baby? Carmen asked, adjusting the ultrasound machine. Yes, Elise whispered, suddenly nervous. What if something was wrong? What if the baby wasn't developing properly? What if? Graham's phone buzzed. He glanced at it instinctively. Sir, Carmen said firmly, I'm going to ask you to put that away. This is your baby's first photo session. Graham looked startled, as if the idea that his phone might be inappropriate had never occurred to him. He slipped it into his jacket pocket with visible reluctance. Carmen pressed the ultrasound wand against Elise's skin, and suddenly the room filled with sound, a rapid rhythmic swooshing that seemed impossibly fast and impossibly strong. There's your baby's heartbeat, Carmen said, her voice warm with the kind of wonder that never seemed to fade, no matter how many times she'd witnessed this moment. Elise's breath caught on the grainy black and white screen. She could make out a tiny form, barely recognizable as human, but undeniably alive. Their baby, moving, heart beating, real. Everything looks perfect, Dr. Henley said, entering the room and studying the screen. Right on schedule for 12 weeks. Would you like me to print some pictures? Yes, please, Elise said, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected. She glanced at Graham, hoping to see her wonder reflected in his face. But he was staring at the ultrasound screen with the same analytical expression he wore when reviewing quarterly reports. Focused, assessing, but fundamentally detached. The due date is March 15th. Dr. Henley continued, making notes in Elise's file. We, Uncle L, want to see you again, in 4 weeks. Any questions? Graham straightened in his chair, and Elise recognized the shift. He was entering negotiation mode. "What about travel restrictions?" he asked. "I have business commitments that might require extended trips abroad." Dr. Henley looked between them, and Elise felt a flush of embarrassment. Most expectant fathers asked about the baby's development or their partner's comfort. Graham was asking about his business schedule. "Generally, travel is fine until the third trimester," Dr. Henley said diplomatically, "but I'd recommend limiting stress and maintaining regular prenatal appointments. Of course, my assistant will coordinate with your office." His assistant, not him. His assistant would manage their baby's medical care, like any other appointment in his corporate calendar. Driving home through Manhattan traffic, Elise studied the ultrasound photos in her lap. In one image, the baby seemed to be waving, a tiny hand raised toward the camera, like a greeting across the impossible distance between womb and world. "We should start thinking about names," she said, hoping to bridge the silence that had settled between them like fog. "There's time for that," Graham replied, navigating around a taxi with practiced precision. "We have more pressing concerns first." "Like what?" "Nursery design, nanny interviews, child-proofing requirements. I've already started researching the best private schools in Manhattan. There's a waiting list for Dalton that we need to get on immediately." "Graham, the baby isn't even born yet. Planning ahead is essential. The best opportunities require advanced preparation." Elle pressed her face to the passenger window, watching Central Park blur past in shades of autumn gold. Other couples were probably having excited conversations about cribs and baby clothes, and whether they hoped for a boy or girl. She and Graham were discussing waiting lists and strategic planning. That evening, while Graham worked late in his study, Elise sat in what would become the nursery. Currently, Graham's secondary office, filled with filing cabinets and an exercise bike he never used. She held the ultrasound photos up to the light, trying to memorize every curve and shadow. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister's name. "Lizzie, I was hoping you'd call. How did the appointment go?" "Good," Elise said, settling cross-legged on the carpet. "The baby's healthy, due in March." "That's wonderful." "And Graham, is he excited?" Elise paused, searching for words that weren't quite lies. "He's processing. You know how he is with big changes. Honey, having a baby isn't a merger. It's supposed to be joyful." "I know." Elise's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I keep thinking that when the baby comes, when it's real and here, he'll change. He'll remember how to be present, how to be the man I married instead of the stranger I live with." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Elise wondered if the call had dropped. "Elise," her sister said finally, her voice gentle but concerned, "people don't change just because circumstances do. If Graham isn't present now, why would a baby make him present then?" The question hit like a physical blow, mainly because Elise had no answer. She'd been clinging to the hope that their child would somehow unlock the Grom she'd glimpsed that first night. The man who quoted poetry and made perfect coffee and understood the difference between solitude and isolation. "I have to believe it will be different," Elise whispered. "I hope you're right, but maybe you should prepare for the possibility that it won't be." After they hung up, Elise remained on the nursery floor, surrounded by filing cabinets and corporate documents, holding photos of a baby who would be born into a house that felt more like an office building than a home. From Graham's study came the familiar sounds of his late-night routine, phone calls to international markets, the soft click of calculator keys, the occasional frustrated sigh when numbers didn't align with projections. Elise placed her hand on her belly, where their child was growing in the darkness, developing tiny fingers and toes and the neural pathways that would someday allow them to feel love and disappointment and hope. "I promise," she whispered to the baby, "I'll love you enough for both of us if I have to." But even as she made the promise, Elise couldn't shake her sister's words or the growing fear that love might not be enough to bridge the distance between the family she wanted and the reality she was building. At 7 months pregnant, Elise felt like she was carrying a basketball under her ribcage. The baby, they'd learned it was a girl at the last appointment, had developed a habit of pressing tiny feet against Elise's lungs, making every breath deliberate and precious. The baby shower was being held at the Pettin Club because Graham's assistant had insisted that the Lockwood family deserves the finest venue. Elise would have preferred something smaller, more intimate, but Graham had already approved the guest list and catering menu before consulting her. She stood in the club's crystal chandeliered powder room, adjusting her navy blue maternity dress and trying to summon enthusiasm for the afternoon ahead. Through the bathroom door, she could hear the voices of wives from Graham's business circle, women who knew her name but nothing about her, who spoke in carefully modulated tones about their children's achievements and their husbands' latest acquisitions. "Elise, darling, are you all right in there?" The voice belonged to Patricia Hartwell, wife of Graham's business partner and the unofficial social coordinator of their circle. "Fine. Just a moment." Elise splashed cool water on her wrists and took a deep breath. She could do this. Smile, accept gifts graciously, pretend that this gathering of near strangers was exactly what she'd dreamed of for her baby shower. The main room had been decorated in soft pinks and whites with elaborate, floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. A tower of presents dominated one corner, wrapped in expensive paper and tied with silk ribbons. "There she is." Patricia swooped over with the enthusiasm of a cruise director. "Doesn't our mother-to-be look radiant?" Graham must be beside himself with excitement. Elise glanced around the room, noting Graham's absence. He'd promised to make an appearance, but a minor emergency at the Hong Kong office had required his immediate attention. She'd learned to translate Graham's emergencies. They were rarely about money, and always about control. "He sends his regrets," Elise said, settling into the chair decorated with a pink sash that proclaimed her mommy-to-be. The afternoon proceeded with choreographed precision games involving guessing baby food flavors and measuring Lisa's belly with ribbon, conversations about the latest trends in nursery design, and which private schools had the strongest waiting lists. Everyone spoke about children as projects to be optimized, investments to be carefully managed. "Have you chosen a name yet?" asked Miranda Chen, wife of Graham's accountant, while Elise unwrapped a silver baby rattle that looked more like a museum piece than a toy. "We're considering several options," Elise replied diplomatically. The truth was, she'd fallen in love with the name Sophia after reading it in a book of poetry, but Graham preferred names that would serve her well in professional settings. Catherine, Elizabeth, Victoria, names that belonged on corporate letterhead and childcare arrangements. Patricia leaned forward with the aidity of someone gathering intelligence. "I assume you'll be using the Petten Agency. They provide nannies for all the best families. We're exploring options." Another diplomatic nonsense. Elise hadn't wanted to discuss nannies at all yet, preferring to imagine the first few months as time she and Graham would spend bonding with their daughter. But Graham had already scheduled interviews with 3 agencies, approaching childcare like any other hiring decision. The gift opening ritual felt endless. Cashmere baby blankets, sterling silver picture frames, designer onesies that costs more than many people's weekly groceries. Each gift came with advice about the right pediatrician, the best baby photographer, the essential classes for infant development. "And this," Patricia announced with flourish, "is from Graham." The box was large and elegantly wrapped with a card and Graham's precise handwriting for our daughter's future. Graham. Inside was a complete nursery monitoring system, cameras, sound detection, temperature sensors, smartphone connectivity, the kind of technology that would allow Graham to manage their baby's care remotely, like overseeing an international subsidiary. "How thoughtful," murmured the assembled wives, though Elise detected something that might have been pity in their carefully neutral expressions. "It's very comprehensive," Elise managed, staring at the instruction manual that looked thicker than most novels. After the guests left, Elise sat alone in the empty club room, surrounded by gift boxes and crumpled wrapping paper. Her feet were swollen, her back ached, and she felt more isolated than she had when the room was full of people. Her phone buzzed with a text from Graham. "Sorry, I missed it. Emergency resolved. Hope it went well. Hope it went well." As if her baby shower were a conference call he'd had to skip, Elise pressed her hands to her belly, feeling their daughter's strong kicks against her palms. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're ready to meet the world, aren't you?" The baby responded with what felt like a tiny hand pressing against Elise's ribs, and for a moment, she imagined her daughter was trying to comfort her, to let her know that at least one person in this family would need her presence more than her productivity. That evening, Graham returned home near midnight to find Elise sitting in the nursery they'd finally set up, a perfect room in soft pastels, with a crib that looked like furniture from a fairy tale, and shelves lined with books. She planned to read aloud during late-night feedings. "How was the shower?" Graham asked from the doorway, loosening his tie. "Educational," Elise didn't look up from the children's book in her lap, a collection of lullabies she'd found at a small bookstore in Brooklyn. Patricia said the gifts were generous. The monitoring system should give us excellent oversight capabilities. Her name is Sophia. Graham paused in adjusting his cufflinks. What? Our daughter. I want to name her Sophia. Elise finally looked at him, seeing her own exhaustion reflected in his face. It means wisdom. I think she's going to be wise. We discussed this. Sophia isn't practical. For what, Graham? For board meetings she won't attend for 30 years. For business cards she won't need until she chooses her own career. They stared at each other across the beautiful nursery that felt more like a showroom than a sanctuary. Graham's phone buzzed in his pocket, and Elise watched his hand twitch toward it instinctively. Answer it, she said quietly. I know you want to, Elise. It's fine. Really, I'm used to it. Graham hesitated, his hand still hovering near his phone. For a moment, Elise thought he might choose her, might choose this conversation, might choose to be present for once. The phone buzzed again. It's Tokyo, Graham said apologetically. The market's open in an hour. He was gone before Elise could respond, leaving her alone in their daughter's perfect room, surrounded by everything money could buy except the one thing she wanted most, a partner who understood that some moments couldn't be rescheduled. Outside the nursery windows, Manhattan glittered with the lights of a million other lives. Other families, other couples, preparing for their first child. Somewhere out there, Elise thought, other fathers were assembling cribs and reading parenting books and losing sleep over everything except profit margins. But in this penthouse, in this perfectly appointed nursery, she sat alone with her daughter's movements inside her, practicing lullabies she might end up singing solo. The contractions started at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, pulling Elise from restless sleep with a pain that felt like her body was trying to turn itself inside out. She lay still for a moment, timing the sensation, wondering if this was false labor or the real thing. Graham slept beside her, his breathing steady and controlled even in sleep. His phone sat on the nightstand, silent, but somehow still commanding attention, like a sentry waiting for the next emergency that would pull him away from whatever moment they were living. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Elise gripped the sheets, practicing the breathing exercises she'd learned in the childbirth class Graham had attended exactly once before, declaring it redundant since they'd hired the best medical team money could buy. By 4:30 a.m., the contractions were coming every 7 minutes. Elise shook Graham's shoulder gently. Graham, I think it's time. He woke instantly, the way successful people train themselves to wake, alert and ready to solve problems. Time for what? The baby. Sophia's coming. Graham sat up, running his hands through his hair. Are you certain? The due date isn't for another week. Babies don't follow schedules, Elise said, managing a weak smile as another contraction built like a wave. Even our baby. What followed was Graham in full crisis management mode. He called Dr. Henley, arranged for a car service, packed Elise's hospital bag with military efficiency, but he handled her labor the way he handled everything else, as a logistical challenge to be optimized, rather than a miraculous moment to be experienced. The ride to Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and contractions that were getting stronger and closer together. Graham sat beside her, fielding calls from his assistant about a client meeting he'd need to reschedule. Can you not do this right now? Elise asked through gritted teeth as another contraction peaked. I'm just clearing my schedule, Graham replied, putting his phone on mute. I want to be completely present for this present. The word felt hollow when his definition of presence still included phone calls and text messages and mental calculations about quarterly projections. At the hospital, everything moved with practiced efficiency. Nurses who spoke in calm, reassuring voices, monitors that beeped steadily, tracking Sophia's heartbeat alongside Elise's vital signs. Dr. Henley arrived, looking composed despite being woken before dawn, examining Elise with professional gentleness. 6 centimeters dilated, Dr. Henley announced. We're making good progress. First babies usually take their time, but Sophia seems eager to meet you. Graham positioned himself in a chair where he could see both Elise and his phone screen. How much longer do you estimate? Labor isn't a business proposal, Dr. Henley said with the patience of someone who'd dealt with anxious fathers before. Babies come when they're ready. The next few hours blurred together in waves of pain and exhaustion. Elise had imagined labor as something she and Graham would experience together, holding hands through each contraction, breathing through the intensity as a team. Instead, Graham managed her labor the way he managed everything else, coordinating with medical staff, asking about timelines, making sure all systems were operating at peak efficiency. I need you to be here, Elise said during a brief respite between contractions. Not managing this, just here with me. I am here, Graham replied, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone. No, you're not. You're thinking about work, about schedules, about everything except what's happening right now. Graham set his phone face down on the bedside table. Better. It wasn't better. Setting the phone down wasn't the same as setting aside the part of himself that treated every moment like a problem to be solved. But another contraction was building, and Elise didn't have energy to explain the difference between physical presence and emotional availability. At 2:47 p.m., after 11 hours of labor, Sophia Elizabeth Lockwood entered the world with a cry that seemed impossibly loud for someone so small. Dr. Henley placed her on Elise's chest, and suddenly nothing else existed. Not the pain, not the exhaustion, not Graham's phone buzzing insistently on the bedside table. Sophia was perfect, tiny and red and furious at being evicted from her warm, dark sanctuary. Her eyes were squeezed shut, but her fingers were already grasping, reaching for something to hold on to in this bright, overwhelming world. She's beautiful, Elise whispered, tears streaming down her face as she studied her daughter's features. Sophia had Graham's strong chin and Elise's delicate nose, but something entirely her own in the set of her mouth. Determined, like she'd already decided she was going to be heard. May I? Graham asked, reaching for his daughter with careful hands. Elise watched as Sophia was transferred to her father's arms. This tiny person who represented all their hopes and fears made flesh. For a moment, Graham's professional mask slipped. He stared at Sophia with something approaching wonder, touching her tiny fingers with a gentleness Elise hadn't seen in months. Hello, Sophia, Graham said softly. I'm your father. Sophia opened her eyes then, dark blue and unfocused, but somehow seeming to study Graham's face. They looked at each other for a long moment, father and daughter meeting for the first time, two strangers connected by biology and circumstance. Graham's phone buzzed again. Elise watched something shift in Graham's expression. Duty calling, responsibility reasserting itself. He glanced toward the phone, then back at Sophia, then toward the phone again. The Hong Kong office, he said apologetically. There's a situation that requires immediate attention, Graham. Elise's voice was quiet but firm. Your daughter is 30 minutes old. I know this will just take a moment. He handed Sophia back to Elise and reached for his phone. As he stepped into the hallway to take the call, Elise looked down at her daughter, who was making soft, snuffling sounds against her chest. I'm sorry, she whispered to Sophia. This isn't how I imagined it would be. But Sophia didn't seem disappointed. She was already falling asleep, exhausted by her journey into the world, trusting completely that she was safe in her mother's arms. Through the hospital room door, Elise could hear Graham's voice, sharp, commanding, fully engaged in whatever crisis required his attention, more than the miracle he'd just witnessed. Elise closed her eyes and tried to memorize this moment. Sophia's weight against her chest, the soft sound of her breathing, the sweet smell of her hair. In a few minutes, nurses would come to check vital signs, and visitors would arrive with flowers and congratulations. Graham would return with updates about market fluctuations and conference calls. But right now, for these few precious minutes, it was just Elise and Sophia, mother and daughter, complete in themselves, needing nothing from the complicated world beyond this quiet room. For the first time in months, Elise felt truly present, not waiting for Graham to be different, not hoping for changes that might never come, just wholly, completely here with the small person who had already taught her something about unconditional love. Outside in the hallway, Graham's voice rose, with familial authority, discussing strategies and solutions for problems that would seem insignificant compared to the simple miracle of Sophia's first breath. But inside the room, Elise held her daughter and whispered the beginning of a lullaby, her voice soft and sure in the afternoon light. The crying started at 11 p.m. and hadn't stopped by 3 a.m. Sophia's wails echoed through the penthouse like an alarm that couldn't be silenced, a sound that seemed to pierce straight through Elise's exhausted brain and lodge itself somewhere behind her eyes. Elise sat in the nursery's rocking chair, Sophia pressed against her shoulder, both of them crying now. 3 months of sleepless nights had blurred into one endless loop of feeding, changing, rocking, and failing to provide whatever comfort her daughter needed. Please, Elise whispered into Sophia's dark hair. Please, just sleep for an hour, just 1 hour. But Sophia only cried harder. her tiny body rigid with whatever pain or discomfort kept her awake every night between 11 and 4. The pediatrician called it colic, a temporary condition that would resolve itself eventually. Eventually felt like a promise that might never come true. Graham's side of the bed had been empty when Elise got up for the third time that night. He'd taken to sleeping in his study during Sophia's difficult nights, claiming he needed rest to function at work. The master bedroom now felt like a museum of their former life. Perfectly made bed, untouched pillows, silence that stretched like an accusation. The nursery door opened softly. Millicent, the night nanny Graham had hired, despite Elise's protests, appeared in her crisp uniform, looking professional and well. "Mrs. Lockwood, why don't you let me take her? You need your rest." "I'm her mother," Elise said, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended. "I should be able to comfort my own daughter." Millicent's expression remained carefully neutral. She'd been with the family for 6 weeks now, long enough to recognize the signs of a mother drowning in her own inadequacy. "Of course, ma'am. I'll just be in the kitchen if you need anything." Alone, again with Sophia's relentless crying, Elise felt something inside her chest crumble a little more. Every book she'd read about motherhood had promised an instant bond, a natural instinct that would guide her through the challenges. Instead, she felt like a fraud holding someone else's baby, pretending to know what she was doing. The days blended into each other, with mind-numbing repetition. Graham left for the office before Sophia woke up and returned after she'd gone to sleep. Their interactions reduced to logistics about feeding schedules and pediatrician appointments. He'd hired a day nanny, too, Francine, who was efficient and kind and everything Elise felt she wasn't. "How was your day?" Graham would ask, during their brief encounters in the kitchen, but his eyes were already distant, his mind already shifting to the next conference call or market analysis. "Fine," Elise would reply, because explaining that she'd spent 4 hours trying to get Sophia to nap, or that she'd cried in the shower that morning, or that she sometimes stood at the nursery door afraid to go in, seemed too complicated for their careful surface-level conversations. On Thursday afternoon, Elise's sister called while she was attempting to eat lunch, a sandwich that had gone cold while she dealt with yet another diaper blowout. "How's my favorite new mom?" Jenny's voice was bright with the kind of energy Elise remembered having once. "Tired," Elise said, bouncing Sophia gently while trying to hold the phone with her shoulder. "That's normal. All new moms are exhausted. But isn't it amazing? Don't you just love every minute?" Elise stared at Sophia, who was making the face that usually preceded another crying session. Love felt like too simple a word for the complex tangle of emotions she felt. Fierce protectiveness, mixed with overwhelming inadequacy. Desperate affection, complicated by bone-deep exhaustion. "It's harder than I expected," Elise said carefully. "Of course it is, but worth every sleepless night, right? And Graham must be such a help. He's very busy with work." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Elise wondered if Jenny was beginning to understand what she couldn't say directly, that she was drowning, that Graham was absent in every way that mattered, that she'd never felt more alone in her life. "Elle, are you okay? You sound." "I'm fine." The lie came automatically, just adjusting to the new schedule. But she wasn't fine. She was disappearing piece by piece into a gray fog that made everything feel distant and unreal. Some mornings, she couldn't remember if she'd eaten the day before. Some afternoons she found herself staring at Sophia's crib, paralyzed by the responsibility of caring for someone so small and helpless. The worst part was the guilt, crushing, relentless guilt that told her she was failing at the one thing that was supposed to come naturally. Other mothers made this look effortless. Other mothers glowed with joy and fulfillment. Other mothers didn't stand in their perfect nurseries at 3 o'clock in the morning, holding their crying babies and wondering if everyone would be better off without them. That night, Sophia's colic was worse than usual. By 2 a.m., even Millicent looked frazzled as she tried various soothing techniques that had no effect on Sophia's distress. "Where's Graham?" Elise asked, though she already knew the answer. "Working late. I believe the London markets opened with some unexpected volatility." Of course, there was always volatility somewhere. Always a crisis that required Graham's immediate attention more than his wife's exhaustion or his daughter's distress. Elise took Sophia from Millicent and walked to the living room's floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at Manhattan's glittering landscape. Somewhere out there, other families were sleeping peacefully. Other fathers were sharing night duty with their wives. Other mothers were finding joy in the chaos of new parenthood. I don't know what you need, Elise whispered to Sophia, whose cries had softened to hiccuping sobs. I don't know how to help you feel better. Sophia's eyes, still that unfocused newborn blue, seemed to look directly at her mother for a moment. Then the crying resumed, and Elise felt the familiar weight of failure settle over her like a blanket she couldn't shake off. Graham's study light was still on at the far end of the penthouse. Through the glass doors, she could see him bent over his computer, completely absorbed in whatever problem required solving. At 2:30 in the morning, he looked peaceful, focused, confident, everything Elise felt she wasn't anymore. She returned to the nursery and settled into the rocking chair, Sophia still fussing against her shoulder. The room was perfect. Every detail carefully chosen, every necessity provided for. But perfection, Elise was learning, wasn't the same as warmth. Money could buy the finest nursery in Manhattan, but it couldn't buy the presence of a partner who understood that some nights required two people to get through. It's just us, she told Sophia softly. I guess it's been just us for a while now. Sophia's cries gradually subsided, exhaustion finally winning over whatever discomfort kept her awake. As her daughter's breathing steadied into sleep, Il continued rocking, afraid to move and wake her, afraid to stop and face the empty bed that waited for her. Outside the nursery windows, dawn was still hours away, and Graham's study light continued to burn like a beacon that would never guide him home. The sound of Sophia's crying cut through the silence of 2:43 a.m., like a blade through fabric. Graham lifted his head from the financial reports spread across his desk, irritated at the interruption. The Tokyo markets had opened with concerning fluctuations, and he needed to analyze the implications before his morning conference call. Sophia's cries intensified, echoing through the penthouse with the relentless persistence of a fire alarm. Where was Millicent? Graham had specifically hired Nigel to handle these situations so that household disruptions wouldn't interfere with his work schedule. He tried to refocus on the spreadsheet displaying currency exchange rates, but Sophia's wails seemed to pierce through the walls of his study. After 20 minutes of trying to concentrate through the noise, Graham finally stood up, loosening his tie with sharp, frustrated movements. The penthouse felt different at this hour, shadows stretching across expensive furniture. The city lights, beyond the windows, creating patterns on the marble floors. Graham walked toward the nursery, his footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Sophia's door was closed, but the crying was unmistakable now. Desperate, exhausted, the sound of someone who had been trying to communicate for hours without being understood. Graham pushed open the nursery door and stopped short. The room was empty. No Millicent, no day nanny, no hired help managing the situation with professional efficiency. But in the rocking chair sat Elise, holding Sophia against her shoulder, both of them crying. Elise's hair hung limp around her face, unwashed and tangled. She wore the same pajama set she'd had on yesterday, or perhaps the day before. Her eyes were red, rimmed and hollow, staring at nothing with the blank expression of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. Sophia writhed in her mother's arms, her tiny face red with exertion, her cries from hours of distress. But it was Elise who made Graham's chest tighten with something he couldn't immediately identify. His wife looked broken. Where's Millicent? Graham asked, stepping into the room. Elise didn't look at him. I gave her the night off. And Francine, they needed rest. You needed rest, too. Did I? Elise's voice was flat, emotionless. I can't sleep anyway. Haven't really slept in weeks. Graham moved closer, noting details he'd somehow missed during their brief logistical conversations. The weight Elise had lost since Sophia's birth, the tremor in her hands, the way she held their daughter like someone going through motions they no longer believed in. Elise, when did you last eat? She shrugged, a movement that seemed to require enormous effort. I had coffee this morning or yesterday morning. The days blend together. Sophia's crying reached a new pitch of desperation, her tiny body arching away from comfort that wasn't coming. Graham watched his wife try to soothe their daughter with mechanical movements, patting, rocking, whispering words that sounded more like prayers than lullaby. Let me take her, Graham said, reaching for Sophia. You don't know how, Elise replied without looking up. You've held her for maybe 10 minutes total since she was born. The accusation hit like a physical blow, mainly because it was true. Graham had managed their daughter's care the way he managed everything else, by delegating to qualified professionals while he focused on more pressing concerns. I can learn, can you? Elise finally looked at him, and Graham was startled by the emptiness in her eyes. Can you learn how to be here at 3 o'clock in the morning when she won't stop crying? Can you learn how to function on 2 hours of sleep for 3 months straight? Can you learn how to love someone who can't love you back yet? Sophia's cries were getting weaker, exhaustion replacing distress, but she continued fussing against Elise's shoulder with the persistence of someone who needed something no one could provide. Graham sat in the chair across from them, his usual confident posture replaced by something more tentative. Tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. Elise's voice cracked. I've read every book, followed every expert's advice, tried everything the pediatrician suggested. Nothing works. She cries every night, and I can't fix it. And I'm supposed to know how to fix it because I'm her mother. But I don't know anything. The words tumbled out in a rush. Months of accumulated failure and self-doubt, finally finding voice. Graham realized he was witnessing the collapse of a person he'd taken for granted, someone whose struggles he'd managed to miss entirely. While focusing on market analyses and profit margins, "You're doing everything right," Graham said quietly. "Am I? Because it doesn't feel right. It feels like I'm failing every single day, like she deserves better than someone who can't even keep herself together long enough to eat lunch." Graham stood and moved to the rocking chair, his hands hovering uncertainly near Sophia's small form. "May I?" Elise hesitated, then carefully transferred their daughter to Graham's arms. Sophia felt impossibly light, impossibly fragile. Her face was still red from crying, but she'd quieted 2 soft whimpers, perhaps surprised by the change of scenery. Graham looked down at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time since those 30 seconds in the hospital. Sophia's eyes were open, dark blue, and unfocused, but somehow seeming to study his face with serious concentration. Her tiny hand curled around his finger with surprising strength. "Hello, Sophia," Graham said softly, the words catching in his throat. "I'm sorry I haven't been here." As if she understood, Sophia's whimpering stopped. She made a small sound that might have been contentment, her body relaxing against Graham's chest in a way that felt like trust. Graham had built his entire adult life around control, around managing variables and optimizing outcomes, but holding his daughter, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his own, he understood for the first time that some things couldn't be managed or optimized. Some things could only be experienced moment by moment, breath by breath. "She likes you," Elise said, and Graham heard something like wonder in her voice. "She's perfect," Graham whispered, touching Sophia's soft cheek with the tip of his finger. "And so are you. You're both perfect. And I've been—" He couldn't finish the sentence. How could he explain that he'd been so focused on providing financial security that he'd forgotten to provide presence? How could he justify missing the first 3 months of his daughter's life because he was too busy ensuring her financial future? Sophia's eyes were growing heavy, her breathing deepening toward sleep. But instead of the peaceful slumber Graham expected, she suddenly stiffened and began crying again. Not the desperate wails from earlier, but a different sound, one that seemed to cut straight through his chest. "She has colic," Elise explained, seeing Graham's confusion. "It happens every night, usually lasts until dawn." Graham stood and began walking slowly around the nursery, instinctively rocking Sophia in his arms. To his amazement, her cries began to soften. "Keep moving," Elise said. "She likes motion. I should have tried that sooner." "You've been doing this alone for 3 months," Graham said, the full weight of that realization hitting him like a sledgehammer. "Every night while I was working. I know the Hong Kong markets don't sleep." Graham continued walking, Sophia gradually quieting in his arms, but it was Elise. He couldn't stop looking at this woman, who had been falling apart while he optimized portfolios and managed international investments. "I'm canceling everything," Graham said suddenly. "All meetings, all travel, everything. I'm staying home." "Graham, no." His voice was firm, the same tone he used in boardrooms, but gentler. "I've spent 3 months managing everything except what matters most. That stops now." Sophia was asleep now, her small body completely relaxed against Graham's chest. But he continued walking, afraid to break whatever spell had finally brought her peace. Outside the nursery windows, Manhattan was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. In a few hours, markets would open and phones would ring, and the world would demand Graham's attention for problems that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the weight of his sleeping daughter in his arms. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of Sophia's room, Graham Lockwood was learning the difference between managing a life and living it. Graham's assistant called 17 times on Thursday morning. He ignored every call. Instead, he sat on the nursery floor with Sophia spread out on a soft blanket, watching her discover her own hands with the kind of fascination he usually reserved for quarterly profit reports. 3 days had passed since that midnight revelation. 3 days since he'd promised to stay home. And Graham was learning that caring for a baby required a completely different skill set than managing a financial empire. She likes the yellow rattle better than the silver one, Elise observed from the doorway, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. She looked better, not completely recovered, but no longer like someone balanced on the edge of collapse. The silver one is from Tiffany, Graham replied, shaking the plastic yellow toy that had come from a drugstore. It cost $300. Sophia doesn't understand luxury brands yet. Apparently not. Graham watched his daughter grabbed for the cheap rattle with determined concentration. She has excellent taste and affordability. It was a small joke, but Elise smiled. The first genuine smile Graham had seen from her in months. The sight of it hit something in his chest. A reminder of the woman he'd fallen in love with, but had somehow stopped seeing. Learning to be present was harder than Graham had anticipated. Every instinct told him to check his phone, to verify market positions, to respond to the urgent emails that multiplied like bacteria in his absence. But every time he reached for his device, Sophia would make one of her small sounds, not quite crying, not quite contentment, and he'd find himself pulled back to the immediate moment. Dr. Henley called, Elise said, settling cross-legged on the floor beside them. She wants to see me next week. A follow-up appointment. Graham looked up from Sophia, noting the hesitation in Elise's voice. Is something wrong? I think she's concerned about how I'm doing. Emotionally. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Graham had spent 3 days learning to change diapers and warm bottles, but he was still learning how to navigate the emotional landscape that motherhood had created for his wife. How are you doing? Graham asked carefully. Elise was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophia's attempts to get the rattle to her mouth. Bet, having you here helps, but some days I still feel like I'm pretending to be someone's mother, instead of actually being one. You're not pretending. Look at her with you. It was true. When Elise held Sophia, their daughter relaxed completely, molding against her mother's body with the kind of trust that couldn't be faked. But Graham was beginning to understand that feeling competent and being competent weren't the same thing. I used to know who I was, Elise continued. I was good at my job, good at taking care of myself, good at being me. Now, I don't recognize myself in the mirror. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, staring at nothing with the blank expression of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. Sophia writhed in her mother's arms, her tiny face red with exertion, her cries from hours of distress. But it was Elise who made Graham's chest tighten with something he couldn't immediately identify. His wife looked broken. Where's Millicent? Graham asked, stepping into the room. Elise didn't look at him. I gave her the night off. And Francine, they needed rest. You needed rest, too. Did I? Elise's voice was flat, emotionless. I can't sleep anyway. Haven't really slept in weeks. Graham moved closer, noting details he'd somehow missed during their brief logistical conversations. The weight Elise had lost since Sophia's birth, the tremor in her hands, the way she held their daughter like someone going through motions they no longer believed in. Elise, when did you last eat? She shrugged, a movement that seemed to require enormous effort. I had coffee this morning or yesterday morning. The days blend together. Sophia's crying reached a new pitch of desperation, her tiny body arching away from comfort that wasn't coming. Graham watched his wife try to soothe their daughter with mechanical movements, patting, rocking, whispering words that sounded more like prayers than lullaby. Let me take her, Graham said, reaching for Sophia. You don't know how, Elise replied without looking up. You've held her for maybe 10 minutes total since she was born. The accusation hit like a physical blow, mainly because it was true. Graham had managed their daughter's care the way he managed everything else, by delegating to qualified professionals while he focused on more pressing concerns. I can learn, can you? Elise finally looked at him, and Graham was startled by the emptiness in her eyes. Can you learn how to be here at 3 o'clock in the morning when she won't stop crying? Can you learn how to function on 2 hours of sleep for 3 months straight? Can you learn how to love someone who can't love you back yet? Sophia's cries were getting weaker, exhaustion replacing distress. But she continued fussing against Elise's shoulder with the persistence of someone who needed something no one could provide. Graham sat in the chair across from them, his usual confident posture replaced by something more tentative. Tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. Elise's voice cracked. I've read every book, followed every expert's advice, tried everything the pediatrician suggested. Nothing works. She cries every night, and I can't fix it. And I'm supposed to know how to fix it because I'm her mother, but I don't know anything. The words tumbled out in a rush, months of accumulated failure and self-doubt. Finally finding voice, Graham realized he was witnessing the collapse of a person he'd taken for granted, someone whose struggles he'd managed to miss entirely. While focusing on market analysis and profit margins, "You're doing everything right," Graham said quietly. "Am I? Because it doesn't feel right. It feels like I'm failing every single day, like she deserves better than someone who can't even keep herself together long enough to eat lunch." Graham stood and moved to the rocking chair, his hands hovering uncertainly near Sophia's small form. "May I?" Elise hesitated, then carefully transferred their daughter to Graham's arms. Sophia felt impossibly light, impossibly fragile. Her face was still red from crying, but she'd quieted 2 soft whimpers, perhaps surprised by the change of scenery. Graham looked down at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time since those 30 seconds in the hospital. Sophia's eyes were open, dark blue, and unfocused, but somehow seeming to study his face with serious concentration. Her tiny hand curled around his finger with surprising strength. "Hello, Sophia," Graham said softly, the words catching in his throat. "I'm sorry I haven't been here." As if she understood, Sophia's whimpering stopped. She made a small sound that might have been contentment, her body relaxing against Graham's chest in a way that felt like trust. Graham had built his entire adult life around control, around managing variables and optimizing outcomes, but holding his daughter, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his own, he understood for the first time that some things couldn't be managed or optimized. Some things could only be experienced moment by moment, breath by breath. "She likes you," Elise said, and Graham heard something like wonder in her voice. "She's perfect," Graham whispered, touching Sophia's soft cheek with the tip of his finger. "And so are you. You're both perfect. And I've been—" He couldn't finish the sentence. How could he explain that he'd been so focused on providing financial security that he'd forgotten to provide presence? How could he justify missing the first 3 months of his daughter's life because he was too busy ensuring her financial future? Sophia's eyes were growing heavy, her breathing deepening towards sleep. But instead of the peaceful slumber Graham expected, she suddenly stiffened and began crying again. Not the desperate wails from earlier, but a different sound, one that seemed to cut straight through his chest. "She has colic," Elise explained, seeing Graham's confusion. "It happens every night, usually lasts until dawn." Graham stood and began walking slowly around the nursery, instinctively rocking Sophia in his arms. To his amazement, her cries began to soften. "Keep moving," Elise said. "She likes motion. I should have tried that sooner." "You've been doing this alone for 3 months," Graham said, the full weight of that realization hitting him like a sledgehammer. "Every night while I was working. I know the Hong Kong markets don't sleep." Graham continued walking, Sophia gradually quieting in his arms. But it was Elise. He couldn't stop looking at this woman who had been falling apart while he optimized portfolios and managed international investments. "I'm canceling everything," Graham said suddenly. "All meetings, all travel, everything. I'm staying home, Graham." "No." His voice was firm, the same tone he used in boardrooms, but gentler. "I've spent 3 months managing everything except what matters most. That stops now." Sophia was asleep now, her small body completely relaxed against Graham's chest, but he continued walking, afraid to break whatever spell had finally brought her peace. Outside the nursery windows, Manhattan was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. In a few hours, markets would open, and phones would ring, and the world would demand Graham's attention for problems that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the weight of his sleeping daughter in his arms. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of Sophia's room, Graham Lockwood was learning the difference between managing a life and living it. Graham's assistant called 17 times on Thursday morning. He ignored every call. Instead, he sat on the nursery floor with Sophia spread out on a soft blanket, watching her discover her own hands with the kind of fascination he usually reserved for quarterly profit reports. 3 days had passed since that midnight revelation. 3 days since he'd promised to stay home. And Graham was learning that caring for a baby required a completely different skill set than managing a financial empire. "She likes the yellow rattle better than the silver one," Elise observed from the doorway, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. She looked better, not completely recovered, but no longer like someone balanced on the edge of collapse. The silver one is from Tiffany, Graham replied, shaking the plastic yellow toy that had come from a drugstore. It cost $300. Sophia doesn't understand luxury brands yet. Apparently not. Graham watched his daughter grab for the cheap rattle with determined concentration. She has excellent taste and affordability. It was a small joke, but Elise smiled. The first genuine smile Graham had seen from her in months. The sight of it hit something in his chest, a reminder of the woman he'd fallen in love with, but had somehow stopped seeing. Learning to be present was harder than Graham had anticipated. Every instinct told him to check his phone, to verify market positions, to respond to the urgent emails that multiplied like bacteria in his absence. But every time he reached for his device, Sophia would make one of her small sounds, not quite crying, not quite contentment, and he'd find himself pulled back to the immediate moment. Dr. Henley called, Elise said, settling cross-legged on the floor beside them. She wants to see me next week, a follow-up appointment. Graham looked up from Sophia, noting the hesitation in Elise's voice. Is something wrong? I think she's concerned about how I'm doing. Emotionally, the words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Graham had spent 3 days learning to change diapers and warm bottles, but he was still learning how to navigate the emotional landscape that motherhood had created for his wife. How are you doing? Graham asked carefully. Elise was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophia's attempts to get the rattle to her mouth. Better. Having you here helps, but some days I still feel like I'm pretending to be someone's mother instead of actually being one. You're not pretending. Look at her with you. It was true. When Elise held Sophia, their daughter relaxed completely, molding against her mother's body with the kind of trust that couldn't be faked. But Graham was beginning to understand that feeling competent and being competent weren't the same thing. I used to know who I was, Elise continued. I was good at my job, good at taking care of myself, good at being me. Now I don't recognize myself in the mirror. I would do anything to make sure you never feel as alone as you did those first 3 months. I would do anything to make sure Sophia grows up knowing her father, not just knowing about him. Sophia stirred in Elise's arms, making the soft sounds that meant she was transitioning between sleep cycles. Without thinking, Graham reached for his daughter, and Elise transferred her smoothly, both parents moving with the synchronized grace of people who had learned to work together. I love you, too, Elise said quietly. Not the man you were trying to be for everyone else, but the man you are when you're just here with us. Sophia opened her eyes and looked directly at Graham, her dark blue gaze serious and considering. Then she smiled, the first real unmistakable smile either parent had seen, and Graham felt something in his chest expand beyond what he'd thought possible. She knows, Elise whispered. She knows we're going to be okay. Outside the nursery windows, Manhattan hummed with its usual Sunday morning energy, people rushing to brunch appointments and business meetings, chasing the kind of success that Graham had spent his entire adult life pursuing. But inside their perfect nursery, holding his perfect daughter, while his perfect wife watched with tears in her eyes, Graham Lockwood discovered that success might be simpler than he'd ever imagined. It might just be this: showing up, staying present, choosing love over everything else every single day. Sophia made a small sound of contentment, and Graham kissed the top of her head, breathing in the sweet baby scent that he'd almost missed entirely. I'm sorry, he whispered to both his wife and daughter. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what mattered. We're here now, Elise said, reaching for his free hand. All 3 of us finally here at the same time. And for the first time since that night, they'd met over coffee and poetry. Graham Lockwood forgot to check the time. 2 years later, on a Tuesday afternoon in Central Park, Sophia Elizabeth Lockwood took her first independent steps. She had been cruising along the park bench where Elise sat reading, her chubby hands gripping the wooden slats for balance, when she suddenly let go. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, as if surprised by her own courage. Then, with the determined expression that both her parents had learned to recognize, she launched herself toward Graham, who was kneeling on the grass 3 feet away with his arms outstretched. Come on, beautiful girl, Graham encouraged, his voice soft with wonder. You can do it. Sophia took one wobbly step, then another, her arms windmilling for balance. On her 3rd step, she pitched forward into Graham's waiting arms, erupting in delighted giggles that echoed across the park like music. She did it, Elise laughed, lowering her book. A new novel she was editing for the small publishing house where she'd returned to work part-time. Our daughter is officially mobile. We're in trouble now, Graham said, lifting Sophia high in the air, her squeals of joy drawing smiles from other families scattered across the grass. No more containing this little explorer. The transformation in their lives hadn't happened overnight. Graham had sold his company to his business partners 8 months after Sophia's birth, maintaining a consulting role that required his presence maybe 15 hours a week. The financial adjustment had been surprisingly easy. They still lived in luxury, just with less of Graham's soul as the price. The emotional adjustment had been more complex. Graham had to learn that presence wasn't just physical, that sitting in the same room while checking emails wasn't the same as being engaged. Elise had to learn to trust again, to believe that Graham's changes were permanent rather than temporary enthusiasm. That would fade when work became demanding again. They'd gone to counseling together, sessions where they'd excavated the slow dissolution of their connection and rebuilt it with more intentional care. Dr. Martinez had helped them understand that love wasn't just a feeling you fell into, but a choice you made every day in small moments and large decisions, in how you prioritized your time and where you focused your attention. I have good news, Elise said as they packed up their picnic supplies. Sophia, now content to sit on the blanket and examine a dandelion with scientific intensity. The Morrison novel I've been working on just got picked up by a major publisher. They want me to continue as the primary editor. That's wonderful, Graham said, and Elise could hear the genuine pride in his voice. The man who had once seen her work as a pleasant hobby now understood it as an essential part of who she was. You deserve this. You're brilliant at what you do. It might mean some travel, a few book conferences, maybe a literary festival in Vermont. Sophia and I will miss you, but we'll manage. We're getting pretty good at bath time and bedtime stories. It was true. Graham had become the kind of father who knew all of Sophia's favorite songs, who could differentiate between her hungry cry and her tired cry, who had memorized the exact way she liked her stuffed elephant positioned in her crib. He'd learned to find joy in the small milestones, first tooth, first word, which had been dada to Elise's mock indignation, first time sleeping through the night. As they walked home through the park, Sophia riding on Graham's shoulders and babbling in the complex language that only toddlers understand, Elise reflected on how different their life looked now from those early months of marriage. They had less money in active circulation, but they had more time. Graham worked from a home office 3 days a week, and when Sophia napped, he and Elise often found themselves talking, really talking, about books and dreams, and the kind of parents they wanted to be. I've been thinking, Graham said, as they approached their building, about expanding our family. Elise stopped walking. Another baby. Maybe if you want to. I know pregnancy was hard, and those first months with Sophia were. He paused, searching for words that could encompass the depth of those dark days. I know I wasn't the partner you needed then. You're the partner I need now, Elise said quietly. That's what matters. So, you'd consider it. Another little person who looks like you and has your stubborn streak and my inability to sleep past 6 a.m. Sophia chose that moment to grab a fistful of Graham's hair, tugging with gleeful determination while chanting, da 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 da. Maybe in a year, Elise said, laughing as Graham tried to extract his hair from Sophia's grip without losing his balance, when this one is walking more and grabbing less. That evening, after Sophia had been bathed and fed and read to sleep with her favorite story about a little bunny who said goodnight to everything in his room, Graham and Elise sat together on their living room couch, no phones or laptops in sight. Do you miss it? Elise asked, the intensity, the high-stakes decisions being essential to million-dollar deals. Graham considered the question seriously as he considered all of Elise's questions. Now, I miss feeling important in that way. Sometimes there's an adrenaline rush to being indispensable, to knowing that your decisions affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. But I've learned that being important to Sophia and to you is a different kind of significance, more meaningful, maybe harder to achieve, but more lasting. Through the baby monitor, they could hear Sophia's soft breathing, the rhythmic sound of deep, peaceful sleep. 2 years ago, that sound had been rare and precious. Now it was the soundtrack to their evenings, the gentle background music of a family at rest. I love our life, Elise said, nestling against Graham's shoulder. I love that Sophia will grow up knowing both her parents, not just hearing about the one who's always at work. I love that you're happy again, Graham replied. Really happy. Not just managing or coping or getting through each day. I love that you know the difference. Outside their windows, Manhattan glittered with its usual promise of ambition and achievement, drawing people from around the world who believed that success could be measured in dollars and deals and corner offices with impressive views. But inside their penthouse, success looked different now. It looked like Sophia's first steps and Elise's published novels and Graham's decision to be present for the moments that couldn't be delegated or optimized or managed from a distance. It looked like choosing love every day in small decisions and large ones in how they spent their time and where they focused their hearts. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Graham remembered that first night when he'd quoted Mary Oliver to a stranger in his office, when he'd thought solitude was preferable to connection. Now he understood that the poet had been wrong about one thing. Not everything died too soon. Some things, if you tended them carefully and showed up consistently and chose them daily, could grow stronger with time. Love, it turned out, was one of those things. Sophia stirred on the monitor, making the small sounds that meant she was dreaming. And Graham smiled, wondering if babies dreamed of the people who loved them. He hoped so. He hoped their daughter was dreaming of a world where she was cherished, where her parents chose each other and chose her every single day. Can you imagine a life where love grows stronger instead of weaker with time, where success is measured not by what you achieve, but by who you choose to become for the people who matter most? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.